Welcome to CATF meeting number 5. It's already nearly 2 months since we kicked off in late September, which is wild for several reasons. But thank you all for spending your afternoon with us again today. We have a really exciting, fun, and full agenda planned. So before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge that we are coming together virtually across the unceded lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Wasco, Cowlitz, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, and that their descendants continue to live, work, and act in relationship with this land. And the work that we do seeks to honor these people who stewarded their environment for time immemorial. So what are we here to do today? So next slide. We've got two major purposes for being here. One is to build familiarity with climate justice and the just transition framework. So this is going to be our first conversation about these two frameworks, and we'll be discussing them more when we start to integrate the prioritization criteria and when we get closer to recommending specific actions. And then we'll continue with our conversation of moving down the mountain from target outcomes and high-level actions to the strategies to reach and achieve those high-level actions. So we're going to begin to develop and prioritize, even though begin is not necessarily the best word here, because you guys have started this already. As you perhaps noticed in your mural board, you already are thinking about the how and the pathways to achieve the high-level actions. But we're going to continue down that conversation today. So next slide. So we're going to build broader understanding of the outcomes, actions, and potential strategies by contributing to content within 2 to 3 categories. So what this means is that you guys will be starting in the categories that you worked with in our last meeting. You'll also have an opportunity to go deep with another area. Some of them may be very comfortable for you. Some of it might be a stretch. And then you'll also have an opportunity to just review and get in touch with the ideas that your colleagues have developed within some of the other category sections. So we're starting to build that and cross-pollinate understanding across categories, knowing that when we get to the place of creating this climate action plan, things are going to be very interconnected. So this is our first step in starting to see some of those cross connections between categories. Again, we're going to generate the strategies to reach high-level actions within the categories that we have established right now, which is really based on what we're using to model. And then we're going to have some time to prioritize the most powerful strategies that we think will get us closer to achieving the high-level actions. So the next slide, we'll talk about our compact agenda. We have 2 short breaks. We're right here in the welcoming overview context setting. We'll have some time to hear from any members from the public in a moment. We'll do a very quick round of introductions, and then we'll provide this introduction to just transition and climate justice. Then we'll have a 5-minute break. So this is just enough time to stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, whatever you need to do. And then we'll come back for a pretty long session where we're working through reviewing the high-level actions and target outcomes that you generated and some of the strategies that naturally came out of that. And you'll start to brainstorm new strategies. And this is the time where you're going to go through a couple different categories. Then we'll have another quick 5-minute break to kind of support the transition in our minds, come back and do some light prioritization. So what are all of those strategies that we think are the most powerful? They're going to get us closer to reaching the high-level actions. And then we'll close. Of course, be sure to take care of yourself. If you need to take more than these 5-minute breaks, get up, grab water, go to the restroom. You get to do that on your own. So next slide. I wanted to introduce this diverge, converge cycle. As we start to develop strategies, we're going to go through a series of iterative processes. So not just today, but over the course of the next few meetings. And as we start to engage with the public, we're going to be doing rounds of this iterative divergence and convergence. So what this looks like today is we're going to be diverging and thinking about what are all of the possible ways to reach those high-level actions. And then by the end of the meeting, we want to converge again on what are the initial paths, what are those best ideas that we'd want to move forward. When we come together in our next session, we'll do a similar process where we'll look big in order to get more clear on where we're going to converge as a group. So just keep this loop in mind as a principle around how we're iterating towards the product that we feel best about, and that's going to work best for Clackamas County. Next slide. By now, we've seen these a handful of times, so I'm not going to go through each one, and maybe I'll just copy and paste it into the chat real quick in case anybody wants to review in depth. Oops. Okay, great. And now we've got some time for public comment. So Ellen, can you introduce this piece?
Yes, I can. Thank you. We do have time for public comment, and I see we do have a couple of members of the public in the audience. If you wish to say anything, please raise your hand and we will call on you and give you a chance to talk. I do see Elizabeth Grazer-Lindsay.
I just had a question about procedure. I was wondering if the member of the public is wanting to go to one of the different topic rooms, how you would specify it so you could end up where you were interested in.
I think, Elizabeth, if you just send us a chat, we can send you to a room, and please understand that you would be there to observe and listen, not to participate, but that shouldn't be a problem.
Thank you.
And Elizabeth, you're familiar with the categories, right?
Pretty much.
Okay, I'm happy to send you a chat with those as well if you'd like.
I don't see any other hands raised, so I will declare public comment to be closed.
Okay. Thank you. And Sarah, you want to walk us through our fun introduction activity today?
Yeah, we are going to do a lightning round introduction this time. So for the first time ever, we are going to do a nonverbal chat-based, not just chat-based, emoji-based introduction. So if everyone goes to chat, down at the bottom where you can enter in a message, you should have sort of two, and then you can identify who you want to receive the message. If you can put that to everyone. And then on the right-hand side, you should have a little like page with a folded corner and then a smiley face. If you click on that smiley face, it gives you a range of emoji. So what we're asking today is to pick an emoji, oh Sally, that is represents how you feel today. So it can, there's a whole range there. So if everyone can pick their emoji, and we'll give just a moment for folks to scan through and see where they are. All right, so we're going to go ahead and shift over to our next agenda item, because as Monica noted, we are pretty packed today. So we're going to start talking about climate justice and just transition. So, all right. So today we're going to expand on the excellent presentation that staff from the Equity and Inclusion Office gave at our August 12th CATF meeting. So Cece and Maria provided a really great foundation for how the county defines and works with the concepts of equity, inclusion, and diversity, as well as leading with race. And I'm going to focus in a little bit more and share some frameworks that inform our approach to the intersection of equity and climate. And so we're going to start with this umbrella climate, our umbrella concept of climate justice. So climate justice looks at the disparate experiences of climate change for different individuals and communities. So when we think about what justice looks like in terms of climate change, we have to consider a few baseline facts. And this is the first one, this idea that not everyone has contributed to climate change equally. And we can think about that both locally, we can think about that within Clackamas County. We can also think about that globally as we look across different countries. And we can think about this concept both currently in terms of who is emitting what now, who is contributing to climate change now, but also historically, and who has contributed to varying degrees over time. Another key principle is that not everyone has benefited from greenhouse gas emissions equally. And when we think about benefiting from greenhouse gas emissions, that's because we don't pollute for the sake of polluting. We pollute to create things and to generate energy and all of these different things. And so the things that have created climate pollution have not been of equal benefit across different communities. And again, we can think about that locally, we can think about that globally, we can think about that currently or historically. And then some people are positioned to suffer more from climate change impacts. We often call these frontline communities. That's a term that you'll hear in a lot of climate circles. And so this idea that different communities have greater exposure to climate change impacts, or through systemic racism and other inequities, have been put in a place where they are more vulnerable for various reasons. And then we also acknowledge that some people are positioned to suffer more from climate action policies themselves. So the things that we have to do to fight climate change also won't impact people equally. And a lot of that is also rooted in our systemic inequities in our society. And then for our climate action to be just, it has to address those inequities. So it's sort of the core principle of climate justice. And in our climate action plan, when we consider actions to reduce greenhouse gases and increase our resilience, so we need to consider who benefits from the different specific actions and who bears the cost of those actions, both indirectly and directly. So within climate justice, there are different more specific frameworks that can be used, and I'll dive into one of those in a moment, which we've talked about. But since this is sort of our foundation, I wanted to see if there are any questions or comments or thoughts that come up before we get more specific. And because I'm juggling some visual things, Monica is gonna help me call on folks if anyone would like to offer any thoughts at this point. Okay, it looks like we're good to move on. Okay, so I mentioned that there are different frameworks for how to apply climate justice, and we're going to talk about one that's called just transition. And so that references to a justice-based transition. And this is a framework that was developed largely by labor unions and environmental justice groups, which is a really interesting mix of perspectives that have come together to develop this. So this is a quote from the Climate Justice Alliance, which has a really great website on just transition if you want to dive into it further. And there's enough packed into this quote that I'm going to just read it out loud. So just transition strategies were first forged by labor unions and environmental justice groups rooted in low-income communities of color who saw the need to phase out the industries that were harming workers, community health, and the planet, and at the same time provide just pathways for workers to transition to other jobs. So big picture, just transition says that if industries need to change or to be phased out in order to achieve environmental goals, then justice requires that the workers have an acceptable path to maintain their well-being and stability. Just transition distinguishes between workers and industries in an important way. The well-being of workers, of people, is important. The well-being or continuation of specific industries isn't necessarily, unless those industries support the well-being of the community and the planet. So the idea here is that not just the environment or the community is harmed by fossil fuel intensive industries, but so are their employees. But those employees will often fight against regulations or limits on those industries because that is how they survive. Coal miners are a really common example of this, and one that comes up often around just transition. And then environmental justice, which looks for fair treatment regarding environmental regulations and practices, also highlights the harm done to community members who aren't employed by the industry. So just transition calls for tools and resources to empower workers to shift into employment that is better for them and better for the wider community. So we'll dive into some examples, but are there any questions or thoughts at this point again?
Just have one thought, just curious about if all workers are open to changing careers, like when you talk about just new jobs, you know, like coal miners or areas, like we may, you know, people may think they're open to changing jobs, but I'm curious if that's a given or if that's something that some people want to go back to being coal miners or they want to change jobs. So I'm just curious about that part of this just transition, is the people side. Is everyone open to that?
Sure, and I think that that's a really valid question. And
can I jump in?
Please.
The answer to that question stems depending on the options in the communities where they live. Workers are more committed to their community more often than not than a specific occupation. So if a coal miner's choice is to stop being a coal miner in a rural West Virginia and move to Chicago, not so much interested. If their choice is to stop being a logger in LeGrand and move to Portland, not so much interested. But if your choice was to be a logger in LeGrand or a Forest Service worker in LeGrand, then probably very interested. So it's, and of course there is our experience in the labor movement. There's probably 15% of the labor force that can't see any other option.
That's what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, but
yeah,
it's not a large number, and it certainly tends not to bubble up into the internal leadership of any worker groups that are based larger than an individual community.
Thanks for your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a great bit of conversation. Any other thoughts before we dive a little bit more into the application of this idea?
There's one comment from Richa in here in the chat. And Richa, would you be interested in sharing this out with the group?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think if Bill said it too, but just that part of our work if we're to follow the framework is also to expand those options so that it does feel like have an option between harming their bodies and the planet every day in their job and choosing something that doesn't do that. So, which is, I think, a good lens to bring to like climate action planning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So to dig into this a little bit more. So when we at Clackamas County say that we're using a just transition framework for this project, we start from a recognition of those unequal harms that we discussed earlier as core elements of climate justice. But also as a government, and this gets to the point that was just made, we also have to acknowledge that most governmental policies have been put in place and then relied on market forces to sort of work out the details of what will shift in order to meet any given regulation. And this has sometimes resulted in communities that didn't have the support or resources to transition or thrive under those regulations. So we'll look at one specific example in a moment, but the core concept is that the county's climate action plan, in order to follow a just transition framework, needs to try to anticipate climate actions that might negatively impact communities, especially those with limited resources, and work to include supports for those healthy transitions. So to dig into a specific and Oregon-based example to help think through this, we're going to look at Oregon timber communities. So this is an example of when just transition might have led to a different outcome. We're not looking at this as an example of when just transition was actually used, but using it as a way to think about how could this have possibly looked different if just transition had been a framework that had been applied. So as many of you know really well, Oregon for a lot of its early history had tons of small and large communities that were built around logging. And today, many of those communities are abandoned, declining, or struggling. Would anyone be willing to summarize in like 1 or 2 sentences, sort of the core common story about why that happened?
I'll take a stab at it. There was a gap in private timber supply and housing demand for a very long period of time. And the industry cut a deal with the Forest Service in the Northwest to harvest above sustained yields to close the gap. And that resulted in about a 2 billion board foot over harvest in the Northwest that was planned to go on for about 12 years. That, of course, was unsustainable from day one, and someplace around year 5 or 6 of that over harvest, not only did the forest start to experience extreme stress, the society, particularly the urban-based portion of the areas, found that socially unacceptable. And we ended up in this wonderful timber war that eventually codified around a single symbol, which was the spotted owl. And within that same process, there was massive mechanization in the industry. And so we sort of had this twofer driving down employment, and that generated a political crisis in the rural areas. And the rest is history.
Just realized I was muted, sorry. Thank you, Bill. I think that is probably more nuanced than a lot of people actually sort of carry with them. So one of the ways that I will sort of condense that is sort of timber towns versus the spotted owl. So really highlighting that codified symbol of the spotted owl, but very much framing it as an either or. And so this idea that because timber communities couldn't harvest anymore because of restrictions based around the Western spotted owl, that put their livelihoods in crisis. And the idea being that the federal government could choose an animal over human communities, I think is a really emotional part of that. And so as Bill's description really highlighted, it's more complicated than a simple either or, and it is important to keep those pieces in mind. And so noting some, but not all of what was brought up by Bill, we've got reduced timber harvests on federal land, and then the story itself that grew up around reduced timber harvests opened the door for much more damaging events as communities felt like they had to make concessions to timber companies around taxes and local regulations to keep some portion of their local economies alive, and automation of timber jobs and companies that were built around that model of taking as much as they could left communities that couldn't support themselves surrounded by these largely degraded forests. So this is one example of a policy to protect the environment, relying on the market to sort out the details. And if we assume as a baseline that the decision to protect the spotted owl, and as noted, a lot of the other decisions that also went into the sort of core value of protecting and preserving the forests, if we assume that that was appropriate, how could a just transition lens have been used in this policy to have a different outcome so that those communities didn't have the same impacts and were able to transition in a way that allowed us to have both? Does anyone have any ideas for something that comes up that could have helped this policy to be less destructive?
I guess for me, I'm just thinking about where the owls are located. If there's a way to concentrate the owl population in an area that they could thrive, and then allow the timber industry to use a forest that was not near that concentration of owls, so that separate two uses is what I think. And that's a feasible idea.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts come up? And I know this is kind of being thrown at you with limited context, so it's okay if there aren't any more ideas.
Jeff offered one in the chat. More sustainable resource extraction versus front loading.
Thank you, Jeff.
I go back to Richa's comment about, oh yeah, so there's some more coming in the chat, but the idea of options and what possible options could have been provided. More job creation that would solve the environmental problems Lisa offered, ensuring educational opportunities from Adam.
Those are great. Thank you. So recognizing that the timber wars, as they are called, is not the issue that we are specifically addressing, although it certainly has implications for us. But as we think about climate action, it can have a really similar feel to the Endangered Species Act for a lot of people in our community. There's a lot of fear that climate action will threaten livelihoods in the same way that the Endangered Species Act did. And for some, that fear is stronger than the fear of climate change itself threatening lives and livelihood. And as our timber history shows, that fear is not unfounded. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that we don't leave communities behind as we work to address the climate crisis for the good of everyone. So climate action is necessary to have a livable future. We've had a lot of discussion and presentations on sort of laying that baseline. But we need to do the work to make sure that it's a livable future for everyone and not just those who have the resources to navigate the changes required. So that's sort of the framework we're working with. And I know that the SSG team has worked with climate justice and just transition in some of their plans. So Moria, if you have any examples of how that has looked in the work that you've done, that would be great to share some of that sort of specific connection.
Sure, yes, although I must say that I did not know that story, and that is a really fantastic example of the conflicts that can arise in exactly these types of situations. So I'm going to use that in the future, or I'm going to invite Sarah to come and speak to our other clients about it. In our experience, an example that comes to mind that is very much lived for me is that I'm from Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. And we, of course, are the province that holds the oil sands, or the tar sands, as lots of people like to know it. We are a province that is filled with people who are highly skilled in drilling and pumping and geotechnical surveying. And they're very concerned. Many of them are very concerned about climate change, and they're also very concerned about their own livelihoods. So they're wondering what's going to happen to them in the future. And we worked very closely with the city of Edmonton to try and structure the climate action plan that we developed with them to focus on the opportunities that would redeploy the skill sets of those people within the context of green energy. So we put emphasis on things like ground source heat exchange and the drilling technologies and skills that would be required to do that. And also on general energy, knowledge of energy systems, both at an industrial scale and at residential and local scales. And a lot of those people have pivoted. I use that word carefully, it's overused, but pivoted very nicely as this transition has started. And they've even set up their own groups to encourage exactly this change, from steel workers to oil sands workers to all of those industries that are going to be experiencing significant change in the future, to help those people find meaningful roles within the new culture. So, but I like the Oregon example the best so far.
Thank you very much. So we have a little bit of time. So I just wonder if this brings up any thoughts for anyone about how we might apply this concept to our work together.
Bill, did you have a question?
Just one other comment. There's always technical solutions to all of these problems. And they are always dwarfed by the folks who politicize these issues and have something to gain by dividing us rather than uniting us. And the whole spotted owl thing could have turned out very different if that issue wasn't politicized for advantages to divide workers amongst workers vis-a-vis the timber company owners, to divide rural from urban vis-a-vis the bipartisan political process in the United States. And what I hope we can do in this group is, at the end of this process, to the greater degree we speak with commonality, we can hopefully counteract some of the hostile polarization that will come into play just because we're in Clackamas County and we already are divided across a whole host of lines, and how we orchestrate or travel through that tortured path will probably determine our success or failure. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts at this point?
Sarah, this is Evan. I'm just wondering, just to clarify your question, were you hoping to hear some examples of issues or sort of categories or topic areas within our process where these concepts seem especially relevant?
I think at this point I am open to sort of what this is raising for folks. So it might be those types of areas that folks are seeing, or it might be other questions about the concept, or yeah, just sort of general conversation. Wasn't aiming in a specific direction, although those are perfectly valid specific directions, to be sure.
I have an example. I don't know if it's exactly what we're looking for, but think about urban growth boundary and how like I'm for creating more density within the urban growth boundary, like housing density near transit routes. And some people in the county want to sprawl out and build more homes out in the outskirts, and that's not near existing services like transit services and other existing services. And so that's a difference of, you know, how things get approached. And so the how urban growth boundary plays out in this region, I think really impacts growth and infrastructure needs. And so that's one way I see this being in our work.
Thank you.
Like Cass, your hand up.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about is especially as part of the transportation group has been, and as a disabled person, is accessibility. And as we're improving and expanding or changing things, like making things more accessible, especially if they aren't right now. An example would be like a lot of our counties, like bus stops are just a signpost on the side of a road next to a ditch with no sidewalks. And so that's not very accessible. And so just like considering accessibility as we're changing things.
Thank you.
Richa and then David.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversation that you all have framed is around how do we support workers in transitioning. So I think just carrying that into our climate action planning, in Apano, we just got some funding from the Portland Clean Energy Fund to support kind of support API folks who we're in community with, who are kind of determining where to work, or we actually have like a significant population of Hmong flower farmers in Oregon. So just in different industries, and we have funding to support them in exploring and committing to pathways towards either like sustainable food or solar wind energy jobs, and just kind of getting folks familiar with the options, but also getting folks open to creating their own options where it feels like there aren't any. So just kind of breaking out of a cycle of these are the jobs that are available, and so those are our only options, and reclaiming some of our ability to create jobs, and that government and industry are not the only folks that have the power to do that. And then just kind of a side comment on the story that you all kind of led with. I think there's also value in naming like that these like stories were being told, that we have to choose between nature and livelihoods, or that these are our only options as workers, are very deliberate stories that are told to ensure that folks kind of stay in their lane and, work in their industry, and create the output that like either industry leaders want to see or politicians want to see. So to me, it's helpful to name that that's intentional. And so there's like disruption of that's required to build a different kind of economy.
Thank you.
David and then Sally.
I think just briefly, it seems to me that if we're going to depart from a business as usual paradigm here, that we need to construct a flexible toolkit to be able to work within, what Oregon requires. We're just part of a bigger pot here. So we have to be practical about that and pragmatic, but also to develop in this toolkit something that allows for flexibility for folks that need to have job retraining, or for folks like us that are forest landowners to educate those people to implement the best forest management practices, the best agricultural practices, provide incentives for folks along those lines, as well as for folks that do need job retraining or those things. I think it's just going to be put all our heads together to come up with something that is more incentive or carrot driven as much as possible.
Thanks, David. Sally. Oops. There you are.
I did that. I want to build on what I think a really important point that Bill was making, and then Risha was also touching on, which is that a really key piece of this plan is going to be the messaging around it and how we actually, it's not just in the implementation, but it's how we position and sell it up, not just to the commissioners, but also just the people. And that there are very powerful forces working very hard, not just in Clackamas County and not just about the climate action plan, but to divide us. And that we need to really work hard to make it clear that a just transition does not just, is not just about like Black and brown communities, but it's all communities. It is literally for all people. And that the timber community is not separate and apart from the Black and brown and frontline communities. There are different kind of frontline community, and that we have to really expose that these divisions are false, and that we are all lifted up by a just transition. Thank you.
Sally. Sarah, I'm looking at you. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think that was a really lovely conversation, and dive into some of the roots of this framework and how it applies to our work, and some things to keep in mind. So this is one that we will keep coming back to, especially as we think more about implementation and what things really look like on the ground. Right now, we're still at that high level of what needs to be done, what are these things that need to be true. But when we get into the how, that's when we have a lot of this opportunity to really make sure that as we accomplish the things that need to be accomplished or plan for those things to happen, that we're doing so in a way that, as folks have said, benefits everyone and makes sure that no one gets left behind. So thank you for that really thoughtful conversation, and we will definitely continue to have this be a part of the conversation as we move through things. So we are a little ahead of schedule, but I think we can go ahead and take a brief break, and then we will come back to more of that strategy development. So Monica, are we still going to do 5?
Let's do 5. So come back at 1:53.
Thank you.
Okay. You guys got a chance to refill your water and stretch your legs. We'll have another 5-minute break in just about an hour, a little bit more than that. And in the meantime, we're going to be doing a lot of work in small groups. And Elizabeth, I think, yes, you gave me your preferred room, so you'll be joining those groups as well. Okay, so you guys remember this mountain image from our last conversation. We started our meeting on the 7th talking about how we're going to move down the mountain, backcasting, knowing that our goal is to summit. And in this case, our goal is to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And then we worked backwards. We said, well, what are the things that we know need to change, that need to occur in order to reach carbon neutrality? We're not talking about how. We're not talking about the strategies to make it happen. We're talking about, we know these things need to change. And then we started to talk about what are those areas of action that would help us reach the target outcomes. And you guys developed several really great ideas that are captured in the mural board that we'll be working with today. And you also started kind of naturally thinking about the how. So in between the last session and this, in this meeting, I, as well as folks with SSG and some folks from the county, looked at everything that you guys put together and organized it. And I shared that document with you, the mural link, so you could see how did all of your ideas land? What stayed within the high level actions, which were the pink stickies, and what got moved into strategies. And so what we'll do today is you'll have time to regroup with your group to review what are those target outcomes that you identified, the high level actions, and then some of the strategies that kind of naturally fell out of your conversation. And then we're going to generate more ideas and more strategies. What are those ways that we would reach the high level actions? And we'll do that in a couple rounds. I also want to remind us that when looking at this framework, the SSG will take the target outcomes and the high level actions and take that in order to create the low carbon scenario. And that's what really tells us what we need to do in order to reach carbon neutrality. So we'll be sharing that at a future meeting. And they've had a chance to review everything that you've created, and they've added a couple prompts, questions, and clarifications that we'll get into in a moment when we transition over to the mural. So next slide. And actually, you can go to the next one. I know that everyone here has been part of some type of meeting, either with a partner when thinking about what to cook for dinner, or when trying to do something for your organization, or with several organizations around brainstorming. And so I don't want to tell you something you already know, but I also think there's just a couple tips I want to offer in order for us to do it well and to reframe why we think it's really important to do brainstorming at this point. So essentially, we are brainstorming to get to good ideas. I had a mentor instructor at one point make the analogy that brainstorming is kind of like pouring beer from a tap, and that at the beginning, you get a lot of froth. And you'd have to keep pouring to get to the good stuff. And so we're thinking about this brainstorming in a similar metaphor, that we want to get through the froth in order to get to the good stuff. What's the good material? How can we work together to really open up our thinking, riff off of each other, think outside of the boxes and the containers and the personal expertise that we bring to the table to come up with those really juicy ideas that we think are going to help us get to our goal. So we're going to go through 2 rounds of brainstorming today to allow us to sift through the froth, get it out, get to the good stuff, and then in the second half of the meeting, we'll do some prioritization to find those really good ones. So next slide. So here's just a couple quick tips. So as you are in, thanks Jeff for that comment. As you are in your groups, if you start to notice any of these things happening where you are getting bogged down in trying to decide or come to consensus on a particular idea, try to be the person in the room to pull your group out of it and say, that's good, let's get it on the board, let's come up with the next idea. Just ask questions enough to clarify so that everyone in the group knows what the other person is saying, but not that you have to come to agreement about what goes up as an idea. If you, kind of along those lines, if you start to think that or feel like your group is getting really narrow or deep on a particular strategy, challenge yourself to zoom out and think outside of the box. Think outside of the box that your group is getting stuck within. Try to work with a concept of yes and. So again, we're not here to argue the value or the right or wrongness of any idea. Just yes, and if there's an idea that you think could be improved, then offer a way to improve it. And then finally, get creative with your ideas. So this is the best stage as we're in this divergent space to really try on something new. So if there's something that you've always wanted to get up on the board somewhere within your organization, but it hasn't felt right, or groups or your folks haven't been agreeable to it, this is a good time. Try it out. This is a good time to be provocative, get creative. So next slide. And then we'll hop over to Mural. So there's a couple guidelines that I want you to keep in mind. And I'll add this to the chat when you guys are in your groups together. But while we're being provocative and innovative and creative and coming up with great ideas, we also have a couple guidelines or things that we hope you'll keep in mind. One is that this is really contributing to that high level action. So whatever you offer, whatever strategy you put up on the board, make sure that it contributes to achieving that high level action. We want it to be concrete and specific. So a lot of the ideas that you guys have already come up with are, so it's a specific policy or initiative or action, scaling a program. Those are specific and concrete. Those are things that would advance the success of those high level actions. So it's catalytic. So we know that this is a 30-year plan, and this goes with the fourth bullet as well, and that right now we're not asking you to come up with every potential strategy to implement between now and 2050. So think about what needs to happen first, what would be catalytic and spur more action, and something that can happen in this first round of implementation plans. So we're thinking this for the first 6 years of the climate action plan. And then we also don't want to limit. If you think that there's some pearls or really great seeds that need to be planted in those first 6 years, that you just want to get into our range of thinking, we don't want to limit you in thinking big in that way either. So I'll put those back into the chat when you get into your groups. And why don't we switch over to the Mural board, and we can start to work there. And why don't I share the link? Okay, there's the link. And I'm going to trust that by now folks are familiar with Mural, and particularly because we had the lowest amount of folks show up for the pre-meeting Mural session, which I think is a great sign that you guys are feeling more comfortable with the tool. But if you need a refresher on some of the tips, you can go up to the top left of the screen. And it's also the image that Sarah is sharing with you right now. So I want to just point out a couple elements with, and I'm going to hide our cursor. So it's going to get less busy in 1 second. I don't want to frighten you. There we go. And Sarah, why don't you toggle to the legend? Great. So this is a reminder that what you generated at our September 7th meeting were the green stickies and the pink stickies. You generated target outcomes and high-level actions. And you guys created them in a horizontal and kind of a linear format, right? And so this construction is helping us to think about how the target outcomes lead down to the high-level actions, which will then have a series of strategies to make them occur. And so when I and SSG and county folks reviewed all of the great content that you put together, we recategorized some of the high-level actions as strategies because they were starting to answer that question of how do we make something like this occur? So when you get into your first group, you're going to start with the category that you were participating in before. And if you forget, you can find your name within the rounds within each of the categories. Take some time, make sure you read what's there and get refamiliarize yourself with what you guys produced in the last session. Now, to the right of the inverted or the pyramid is a couple other colors. So in light blue, those are ideas that came directly from SSG, things that they recommend be added to a category's ideas. An orange sticker is a prompt from SSG. So that's something that as they were reviewing and thinking about the low carbon scenario, they had questions either around data or context, and they offered these prompts as ways to help you think through what could potentially be added to either the high level to the as strategies. There's a line along the bottom of the mural screen, and you'll see just a handful of stickies down there. So Sarah, don't worry about toggling down there. I think it'll get too dizzying for people. But if you look just along the bottom of the mural, there's a line. So what we did is we condensed the categories down to 4. So if folks remember in our 9/7 meeting, we had transportation as a category, energy as a category, buildings as a category, and then it was food, it was ag, forestry, food and timber, I believe. And we condensed, and then we had water, wastewater, and materials management. And there was land use as well, integrated into the food and ag and land management group. We learned that land use was a difficult topic for that particular group to weigh in on. And we also learned that the water and wastewater and materials management, that there was less expertise in the room and interest in participating in that, and that the counties are already doing really great work. So we took water and wastewater and added that into food and natural resources. So you'll see a couple ideas within that category that came from the water, wastewater, and materials management group. And then for any land use related topics, those are along that bottom strip. So if a group identified it as this is an intersection with land use, I know that the food and natural resources group, while you didn't develop a lot of high-level actions and strategies related to land use, you did come up with a couple ideas. And so those are captured down there as well. And so we're going to invite you, if as you're thinking through any of your categories, you know that there's a high-level action or a strategy that has a relationship with land use, to add it down there so that we can capture it. But we're also not asking any one of you to take that on as a core topic. And yellow sticky, so now going back to this square of colors, the yellow stickies are comments that were carried over. So there were several comments that you guys left in the mural or other people offered. If they weren't converted into a strategy or a high-level action, or if it was real obvious that it was a question that the group was still carrying, we added it to this mural board so that you guys could continue to discuss it and consider it in your strategy development. So that's just orientation to what's here. Is that clear for folks? Any clarifying questions about what you're looking at, where to find information? Can I get a thumbs up? Feeling good? Okay, great. So now if we can move over to round 1 instructions for strategy development. I'm going to zoom in too. So like I said, you're going to start with the categories that you were a part of in our 9/7 meeting. And again, if you need a reminder, or if your group was collapsed and moved into others, then just find your name under R1 in any of the categories, and that's where you'll know to show up on the mural board. We're going to have about 30 minutes in this first round. And what I'd like you to do first is just take 5 minutes and review what's there. So if you already reviewed it in the Mural link that we sent out, that's great. Just get grounded with what's there. And I want to challenge you to come up with at least one strategy per target outcome. So any given target outcome may have more than one high-level action. This is just a way for you to start to get the wheels greased around, okay, what exists and how do I get my mind into that gray sticky level, into that how to reach any of the high-level actions that exist with the target outcomes. And you can just add those ideas as a new sticky note in gray. At around 5 minutes, we'll prompt you to come back as a group within your small group, so not the large group, but to start to discuss with each other and just work through the target outcomes. So what's here? What are the high-level actions? Review any of the seeded strategies. So that's what was carried over from September 7th. Review any new ideas that came up from your independent review and consider what else is needed. And then you add it. And again, we're in the brainstorming phase. So it's not what's the best idea, what's the worst idea, just what do we think could help us get there? If you are moving through ideas and you start to see some similar intent behind ideas, you can start to group them or cluster them next to each other. And if a strategy works better in another high-level action, you have the freedom to move it. I think in some cases, it might even be copying and pasting if you think a strategy could work across more than one high-level action. And if you get through them all, then turn your flame red. And so we'll know that you're ready to move on to the next stage. And if you have a question, turn your flame blue, and that will indicate to me and Moria to come into your room and help you work through your question. So before we move into the groups, any questions about the process, about the instructions? Feel ready? Moving down the mountain? Gray, sticky it up? Okay, cool. So Garrett's gonna send you an invitation to your room and I'll call you back in just about a half hour.
All right, and a reminder to all staff that are gonna be in the room, Eben, Sarah, Dr. Present, and Ellen, please hit that record button. And I am now gonna open all the rooms.
Okay, I was able to pop into several of your conversations. There was great work, great conversation, good discussion, lots of ideas being added, and I'm sure it feels like you could continue to have this conversation for a long time. Yeah, particularly with the folks that you were with. And don't worry, in the spirit of iteration and in the spirit of learning and adding and continuing to discuss all these topics, this won't be the last time. But we are trying to generate ideas now. And so what we're going to do is move into a new category. And we're also trying to expose you to some of the other ideas and conversations that are happening in the other categories and amongst your colleagues. I know that I've heard from nearly all of you about other categories and topics that you feel comfortable with. Either you have a level of expertise or you have a strong interest. And I also just want to recognize that some of these places it might feel like a stretch for you, but take your lived experience. You all live in Clackamas County. You all have experience interacting with the systems within these categories. And that's knowledge, and that's expertise too. So don't shy away. So we're going to move into a new category area with new folks. The staff people that were representing these categories are going to stay in each of those rooms. So they will help to support the context and the flow, and they'll also help point you to where you'll start. So for staff folks, if there were target outcomes or high-level actions that didn't get discussed in round one, feel free to start with those so that at least we're making it through all of those target outcomes on the board. once you make it through all of the target outcomes, go back and start to cluster ideas. So in the same vein as we discussed with round one, which I have a feeling didn't get accomplished because you still were in a lot of the generative space, go back and just see if there's any ideas that sound similar. So after you've reviewed, added new ideas, go back and cluster, see if there's any opportunities for grouping. And then we'll move into round three where you'll be able to review another category, but from a more passive space. So similar again to our first round, take a few minutes, review what's there, add any initial ideas that come up. Then the staff support person will lead you to that to the target outcome to begin with. You'll generate ideas. Once you get through all of the target outcomes on the page, and have added things, then you'll start to cluster, and then let me know if you finish. And I'm already making adjustments in the agenda so that you guys feel like you have enough time to get comfortable in the rooms and the topics that you're engaging with. So I'll do my best not to rush you, so you have some time.
Ray has a question, Monica.
Okay, Ray. Thanks, Ellen.
I'm just curious if we're selecting our own breakout rooms or you like putting us in the breakout rooms.
So if you look at the mural up in the underneath the red category, you'll see an R1, R2, R3. Mm-hmm. That's like your table seating. So okay. we've already selected what groups you're going to move into, and most of it came from you identifying areas that you had another level of expertise within.
Cool.
And then the round three is just where haven't you touched yet? And so that may not have to do with an area that you feel really comfortable with, but we want to give you exposure to that information. So the breakout rooms will send you to that place. And Garrett, are we ready to go through the portal again?
We are ready. Staff, please remember to hit that record button. And actually, there's one person who's not listed. Lisa does not have an assigned room that I can see. Where is she supposed to travel to?
Let's see. Lisa, do I have you assigned in round two? I don't. Lisa, you get to choose.
No pressure.
Put me back in the one I was in. That's fine.
Lisa gets to do that because she wasn't at our last session. So this is like her second time in the same category.
Okay, so the same one that you just came from.
Yeah.
All right.
That was the food and natural resources.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, we're ready. I will open the rooms.
Thank you. Hi, folks. All right, so we've got just a couple minutes left. And like I mentioned, well, first of all, thank you for sticking with what can be kind of exhausting work, right? We're asking you to put a lot of brain power into thinking through how to make these actions real. And this is really, really formative work. You guys are helping to shape literally the content. What worked well with you? What worked well for you with this meeting? If anything, if you'd like to see anything different for future meetings, and then you're free to go.